The rhythmic clinking of silver against fine bone china echoed softly beneath the soaring, gilded ceilings of the Obsidian, the most guarded dining room in the city. Leona R. Wright smoothed the front of her crisp black vest, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality that betrayed nothing of the calculated alertness humming beneath her skin. For 3 years, she had mastered the quiet geometry of service, moving with a stillness that ensured she was never truly noticed, yet always positioned to see everything. At 25, Leona had elevated invisibility to a science, drifting through the high-end establishment like a shadow among the glittering chandeliers and marble pillars. She was content with the anonymity, grateful for a position that offered a clean break from the blood-slicked emergency rooms of her past and a steady paycheck to secure her newfound peace. "Table 4 is ready for their main course," the floor manager murmured, checking his watch with a frown. "And, Leona, stay sharp. Mr. Sink is in a particularly foul mood after the board meeting, and his mother doesn't tolerate delays." Leona gave a curt nod, lifting a silver tray with hands that remained impossibly steady. Robert A. Sink. The name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and terror across the underworld. She had served his private alcove for months, watching the way he commanded a room without uttering a single word. To him, she was merely another fixture of the restaurant's opulence, a ghost in a vest, as silent and unremarkable as the vintage wine she poured. The silence that followed the sudden, sickening thud of the chair was more terrifying than the scream that preceded it. Leona was only 3 paces away when the shadow, a man who had blended perfectly into the kitchen staff, lunged from the periphery and buried a thin blade into the chest of Robert A. Sink. The attacker vanished into the service corridor before the first drop of blood hit the white marble floor, leaving the room paralyzed. Robert remained standing for a heartbeat, his white suit jacket blooming with a violent, expanding crimson stain. As the restaurant's security detail fumbled for their weapons and diners dove beneath silk-draped tables, Leona didn't scream. She didn't run. The art of invisibility she had cultivated for years fell away, replaced by the cold, clinical clarity of a trauma surgeon. She dropped her silver tray, the clatter ringing out like a starter pistol, and reached Robert just as his knees buckled. "Lock the doors, no one leaves," the floor manager shrieked, but Leona was already on the floor, her hands pressing firmly at the center of Robert's chest. Robert looked down at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and restrained pain, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. "Don't speak," Leona commanded, her voice devoid of its usual subservient lilt. It was sharp, authoritative, and moved with a practiced grace that cut through the panic in the room. She ripped away his silk tie, using it to create a makeshift pressure bandage, her fingers moving with a precision that suggested she had done this 1,000 times before in a life she had tried to bury. Beside them, Robert's mother remained seated. She didn't weep. Instead, she raised a single, calm yet authoritative finger, signaling the surrounding guards to stand back and give the waitress room. "He's going into shock," Leona muttered, her eyes focused entirely on the wound. She could feel the hammering of her heart, but her hands remained impossibly steady as she monitored his pulse. The luxury of the restaurant, the crystal chandeliers, and the scent of expensive wine faded into a blur of gray. In this bubble of relative privacy amidst the chaos, she wasn't a waitress serving the elite. She was the only thing standing between a mafia boss and the catastrophic end of his life. As the heavy brass locks of the restaurant clicked into place, sealing them inside, Leona realized the carefully constructed facade of her new life had finally cracked, leaving her exposed to the very world she had fled. The sirens wailed in the distance, a low, mourning sound that felt miles away from the pressurized silence of the sealed restaurant. Leona felt the weight of Robert's mother's gaze, a physical sensation, heavy and sharp as a needle. While the syndicate soldiers stood frozen, their faces masks of bruised knuckles and wounded pride, the matriarch remained the only fixed point in the room. She watched Leona's hands, bloody, efficient, and unwavering, with a frighteningly clinical interest. "The ambulance will be intercepted," the older woman said, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos. She didn't look at the manager or the guards, she looked only at Leona. "My son will not be taken to a public hospital where he can be finished off by a coward with a second blade." Robert groaned, his grip tightening on Leona's forearm. The contact sent a jolt through her system, a reminder of the unexpected electricity that came from touching a man whose world was built on violence. He was fading, his skin turning the color of ash against the stark white of his ruined suit. "You," the mother commanded, raising that single, authoritative finger once more. "You saved his life in the first 60 seconds. Most people just smile and nod when they realize who we are, but you didn't flinch." "I was just doing my job," Leona whispered, her rehearsed smile long gone, replaced by the clinical mask of her past life. "No," the woman countered, her eyes holding a universe of stories and a steel that left no room for refusal. "A waitress pours wine, a surgeon stops the shadow of death. You are coming with us to the estate." Leona's heart hammered against her ribs. Her academic life, her scholarship, and the art of invisibility she had perfected for 3 years flashed before her eyes like a dying dream. If she stepped into the black SUV waiting at the service entrance, the clear lines of safety and danger would wash away forever. "I can't just disappear," Leona managed, thinking of the half-finished paper on her laptop and the normal existence she had fought so hard to carve out. "You already have," the matriarch said, her expression softening into something almost predatory. "The moment you touched him, you became part of this story. Now finish what you started." As the guards moved in to lift Robert, Leona realized this wasn't a request. It was a debt of honor that had already been signed in blood. She reached for her coat, leaving the ghost-like persona of a waitress on the marble floor of the obsidian. The antiseptic scent of the private medical wing at the Sink estate was a sharp contrast to the expensive cologne and wood smoke of the restaurant. Leona sat in the dim light of the recovery suite, her hands finally resting, though the phantom weight of Robert's pulse still seemed to thrum in her fingertips. She had spent the last 6 hours monitoring the machines, her eyes tracking the jagged green lines of the heart monitor with a fluency she hadn't permitted herself in years. When the man in the bed finally stirred, his movements were cautious, a restrained pain tightening his features. Robert A. Sink didn't wake up with the confusion of a typical patient. He woke up as a predator, his dark eyes snapping open and immediately locking on Leona. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice a jagged blade of sound. Leona stood, her posture shifting back into the art of invisibility. She offered him a small, polite curve of the lips, the rehearsed smile she used to deflect unwanted attention from the elite diners at the Obsidian. "Your mother insisted I stay until you were stable, Mr. Sink." Narrowing as he took in the precision of her movements. A waitress doesn't know how to adjust a titration pump, and a waitress doesn't have a clinical accent that sounds like she spent 8 years in a residency program at Johns Hopkins. Leona's hand faltered for a fraction of a second, a surprising surprise in her otherwise perfect composure. She straightened her black vest, trying to reclaim the distance of her ghost-like persona. Robert's gaze didn't soften. He tracked her as she moved to check the IV line, his eyes narrowing. "I grew up around doctors, sir. You pick things up." "Don't lie to me," Robert said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur that felt more dangerous than the blade that had pierced him. "You flinch when I mentioned the security leak, but you didn't flinch when you had your hands inside my chest. You have kind eyes despite the fear you carry, as my mother says, but those aren't the eyes of a server. They're the eyes of someone who has seen the exact moment a soul leaves a body." The silence in the room became icy and paralyzing. Leona realized that while she had been watching him for months as a piece of the restaurant's decor, he had been dissecting her, peeling back the layers of her carefully constructed facade. "Who are you really, Leona R. Wright?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. "Because the woman who saved me tonight isn't a waitress. She's a ghost with a scalpel." Leona met his gaze, the exhaustion of maintaining her facade finally giving way to a strange sense of surrender. The clear lines between safety and danger were gone, and as Robert reached out, his fingers brushing the hem of her sleeve, she knew her academic life was officially a thing of the past. The heavy silence of the Sink estate was a luxury Leona couldn't afford to enjoy. While Robert slept under the watchful eye of his mother, Leona's mind remained back at the restaurant, replaying the high-intensity cold open of the attack with the precision of a crime scene investigator. The shadow in the kitchen had moved with too much familiarity, bypassing high-tech security checkpoints that even the most seasoned diners never saw. Driven by a quiet competence that refused to rest, she convinced Robert's most trusted driver to take her back to the now shuttered Obsidian under the cover of a midnight escape. The restaurant was a ghost of its former self, the crystal chandeliers dimmed and the marble floors still bearing the faint, scrubbed outlines of the evening's violence. Leona bypassed the main dining room and headed straight for the service corridor. This was her domain, a place where she had spent months practicing the art of invisibility. She moved through the narrow hallway, her eyes constantly scanning for threats, just as she had been trained in a past life she tried to bury. Near the industrial walk-in freezer, she spotted it. A small, black, sleek, and obviously untraceable electronic bypass device attached to the secondary service entrance. It was a security leak that couldn't have been placed by an outsider. The stalker hadn't just infiltrated the kitchen, he had been invited. Leona knelt, her hands trembling slightly not from fear, but from the chilling realization that the suited men Robert trusted were the very ones who had left him visibly wounded. She pulled out the burner phone Robert's mother had pressed in her hand earlier. As she examined the corridor, she found a discarded service schedule with handwritten notations on the margin, codes for the camera blind spots she herself had used to avoid notice. The realization was icy and paralyzing. This wasn't just a stalker's obsession, it was a calculated betrayal from within the heart of the organization. "Loyalty changes when power shifts," she whispered to the empty hall, recalling a phrase she'd heard among the elite. The clear lines between safety and danger were now completely erased. She wasn't just a waitress or a hidden surgeon anymore. She was the only one who knew that the shadow was still lurking inside Robert's inner circle. As she pocketed the bypass device, she knew her normal existence was gone. She had found the thread of a security breach that led straight back to the estate, and if she didn't act, the next dark red bloodstain would be permanent. The heavy bypass device felt like a lead weight in Leona's pocket as she stepped back into the dim, pressurized silence of Robert's recovery suite. He was awake, propped up against the pillows, the dark red stain of his bandages a stark reminder of how close the blade had come to his heart. His mother sat in the corner, her calm yet authoritative presence a silent anchor in the room. Leona didn't wait for him to speak. She walked to the bedside and placed the electronic bypass and the notched service schedule on the linen sheets. "It wasn't just a stalker," she said, her voice reclaiming the sharp, clinical clarity that had first stunned him. "The service corridor was bypassed from the inside. Someone gave him the codes, the blind spots, and the key. You have a traitor in your house, Mr. Sink." He stared at the device, a muscle twitch in his jaw as the weight of her words settled. He looked up at her, his dark eyes studying her with an uncomfortable intensity that made her breath hitch. "You went back there alone," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Brave. Foolish, but brave." "I don't like being used as a distraction for a murder," Leona countered, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline finally began to ebb. Robert reached out, his fingers brushing the back of her hand in a touch that felt both threatening and oddly reassuring. He looked at her not as a waitress, but as a kindred spirit who understood the cost of survival. "My mother says you have the hands of a healer and the eyes of a ghost. I've had my people look into Leona Wright. It's a clean name. Too clean, like a fresh coat of paint over a charred wall." Leona stiffened, the familiar panic rising in her chest. Her academic life and the peace she had fought for felt like they were slipping away. "I don't care who you were running from," Robert continued, his grip on her hand tightening just enough to command her full attention. "But whoever they are, they won't find you here. I am offering you a debt of honor. Stay. Help me navigate the shadows of my own organization. Help me find the leak that my own suited men missed. In return, the Sink family becomes your shield. Your past will stay buried deeper than the men who tried to kill me tonight." Leona looked at him, then at his mother, who nodded once with a hopeful smile. The clear lines between safety and danger had converged. She was no longer a piece of restaurant decor. She was an ally in a catastrophic game of power. "I'm not a soldier," Leona whispered, her rehearsed smile finally replaced by a grim, determined reality. "I don't need a soldier," Robert replied, his eyes alive with grim satisfaction. "I need a ghost who sees what everyone else ignores." The transition from the city's concrete edges to the mist-shrouded family retreat was seamless, a journey made in the back of an armored SUV that felt more like a mobile fortress. The aptly named Lakeside Estate was a masterclass in architectural silence, glass walls overlooking water that was as dark and still as obsidian. Here, the air was cold and clean, stripped of the exhaust and desperation of the city, yet the atmosphere remained thick with the icy and paralyzing reality of the hunt. Leona settled into her role with a fluidity that surprised even her. In the quiet of the glass-walled master suite, the art of invisibility she had practiced at the restaurant began to evolve. She was no longer a ghost, she was the guardian of Robert's recovery. She changed his bandages with the clinical precision of a surgeon, her hands moving over his skin with a quiet competence that seemed to soothe the raw edges of his restrained pain. It was during these moments of forced intimacy that the unexpected electricity began to hum between them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and cast long, amber shadows across the room, Leona reached out to check Robert's temperature. Her palm lingered against his forehead, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The silence of the lake seemed to press against the glass, amplifying the hammering of her heart. Robert reached up, his hand closing around her wrist, not with the iron grip of a Mafia boss, but with a gentleness that was far more dangerous. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers with an uncomfortable intensity that stripped away her rehearsed smile. "You have a way of making the world feel quiet, Leona," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that traveled up her arm. "Even when I know the wolves are at the door." Leona swallowed hard, the clear lines between safety and danger blurring once again. "It's the medication," she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. "It's not the medication," he countered, his thumb tracing the delicate pulse point on her wrist. "It's the fact that you're the only person in my life who doesn't want something from me. You just want me to breathe." In the bubble of relative privacy provided by the estate, the barriers of their respective worlds began to erode. Leona found herself noticing the way his eyes softened when his mother entered the room, and Robert began to recognize the kindred spirit beneath her medical mask. They were two people forged in different fires, now finding a strange, unexpected sanctuary in the shadow of a war that was only just beginning. The rain began to lash against the glass walls of the retreat, turning the world outside into a blurred landscape of slate and shadow. Inside the library, the air smelled of old paper and the medicinal tea Robert's mother insisted on brewing herself. The matriarch sat across from Leona, her calm yet authoritative presence softened by the warm glow of a desk lamp. She watched Leona's hands, which were busy organizing the medical supplies with a quiet competence that had become the heartbeat of the house.
"He wasn't born for the blade, you know," the mother said softly, her voice cutting through the rhythmic patter of the rain. "Robert spent his youth trying to outrun the family name. He wanted to be a public defender. He has a strong sense of justice that this life has tried its best to strangle." Leona paused, a roll of gauze in her hand. She looked toward the hallway where Robert was resting, imagining the fierce, tall and imposing man as a young student of the law. When his father was betrayed, the mother continued, her eyes distant, Robert took the mantle not for power but for protection. He became the monster so that his sisters and I could sleep without checking the locks. He is a man of honor trapped in a world of ghosts. She leaned forward, her gaze sharpening. "Much like you, Leona. You have kind eyes despite the fear you carry." Why was a woman with the hands of a healer hiding in a waitress uniform? The exhaustion of maintaining her facade finally became too much for Leona to bear. The clear lines between safety and danger had blurred so thoroughly that the truth felt like the only anchor left. "I was a surgical resident in Detroit," Leona whispered, the words feeling heavy and jagged in her throat. "I treated the wrong man, a rival to a local gang. When he died on my table, they didn't see a medical failure. They saw a targeted hit. They came for me at my apartment. I barely made it out." She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had saved Robert. "I thought if I became a ghost in a restaurant I'd be safe. I thought if I was invisible, I could finally stop being afraid." "The world doesn't let talent like yours stay hidden," the mother replied, reaching across the table to cover Leona's hand with her own. "You and Robert are kindred spirits, Leona. You both wear masks to protect the things you love." In that bubble of relative privacy, the last of Leona's rehearsed smile vanished, replaced by a raw, determined reality. She realized she wasn't just caring for a patient anymore. She was standing beside a man who understood the weight of a borrowed life. The storm outside the retreat reached a fever pitch, the thunder rolling over the lake like the heavy artillery of a coming war. Inside the study, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the icy and paralyzing tension of a trap being sprung. Leona stood by the monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard of the laptop she had recovered from the restaurant's server room. Beside her, Robert sat in the shadows, his face a pale, restrained mask of focus, his wound still tender but his mind sharp. "The digital signature on the bypass device isn't external," Leona whispered, her clinical tone cutting through the low hum of the machines. "It was encrypted using a high-level security clearance, one that only 4 people in your organization possess." Robert leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as the data began to cascade down the screen. "Show me the access logs for the service corridor on the night of the attack." Leona pulled up the encrypted file, her quiet competence making short work of the firewalls. As the name scrolled past, one entry glowed in deep amber. It was a login from a handheld device registered to Marcus Thorne, Robert's closest associate, and the man who had stood at his right hand for a decade. The realization was catastrophic. Marcus wasn't just a suited man in the background. He was the architect of the security protocols that had been designed to keep Robert safe. "Marcus," Robert breathed, the name sounding like a death sentence. He was the one who suggested the obsidian for the dinner. He was the one who vetted the kitchen staff. "It's more than just a leak, Robert," Leona said, pointing to a series of intercepted messages. "He hasn't just been talking to the Stalker. He's been coordinating with a rival syndicate to dismantle your shipping routes while you're incapacitated. The stabbing wasn't meant to be a quick death. It was meant to keep you here, distracted and healing, while he liquidated your assets." The betrayal felt like a second blade in the dark. Robert stood, the expected electricity of his anger radiating through the small room. He looked at Leona, and for a moment, the clear lines between safety and danger were gone. He saw not just a waitress or a doctor, but the only person in his world who had remained loyal without a price tag. "He thinks I'm still bedridden," Robert said, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper. "He thinks the shadow in the kitchen finished the job. He's coming here," Leona realized, her eyes wide as she saw a new ping on the security perimeter. "He's not coming to check on your recovery. He's coming to finish it." The art of invisibility was no longer an option. As the headlights of a single black sedan cut through the rain at the edge of the estate, Leona realized the final stand had begun. The traitor was at the gates, and the only thing standing between Robert and a cold grave was a woman who had once been nothing more than restaurant decor. The tires of the black sedan crunched over the gravel, a sound like grinding teeth against the roar of the storm. Inside the darkened retreat, the quiet competence that had defined Leona's medical career shifted into a different kind of survival. She moved through the shadows of the glass-walled living room, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was the last line of defense for the Sink family. "They're coming through the lakeside entrance," Leona whispered into the handheld radio, her voice steady and clinical. She had already positioned Robert's mother in the reinforced panic room behind the library, and now she returned to Robert's side. He was standing, leaning heavily against a mahogany desk, a hand pressed to his restrained pain, but his eyes were alight with a predatory fire. The glass shattered, a violent, explosive sound that echoed through the house. The Stalker, flanked by two of Marcus's compromised guards, stepped into the light of the dying fireplace. The shadow in the kitchen had finally come to reclaim his prize. "Stay behind me," Robert rasped, but Leona didn't listen. She knew Robert was too weak for a prolonged struggle. Using the defensive tactics she had learned during those terrifying nights in Detroit, she didn't meet them with a gun, but with the environment. She killed the lights, plunging the room into icy and paralyzing darkness. In the blackness, Leona moved like the ghost she had spent years becoming. She used a heavy medical oxygen canister as a blunt instrument, swinging with a force born of desperation, catching the first guard in the temple. As the Stalker lunged toward Robert's silhouette, Leona intercepted him. She didn't use a blade. She used a high-concentration sedative she had prepared from her medical kit, slamming the syringe into the attacker's neck with the practiced grace of a woman who knew exactly where the carotid artery lay. The Stalker gasped, his movements turning sluggish as the chemical recalled her past life of emergency interventions. He collapsed at Robert's feet just as the Loyalist reinforcements, alerted by Leona's earlier signal, swarmed the room. The final stand was over in a matter of minutes, leaving only the sound of the rain and the heavy breathing of two people who had survived the catastrophic betrayal together. Robert looked at Leona, his dark red blood stain beginning to seep through his fresh bandages from the exertion, but his expression was one of profound awe. "I told you," Robert murmured, reaching out to steady himself against her shoulder. "You aren't a waitress. And you aren't just a boss," Leona replied, her rehearsed smile gone forever, replaced by the raw, unexpected electricity of a woman who had finally stopped running. In the ruins of the glass room, the clear lines between safety and danger had vanished, leaving only the two of them. The aftermath of the betrayal left the lakeside retreat in a state of somber reflection. As the morning sun crested over the water, the mist began to lift, revealing a world that looked identical to the day before but felt fundamentally transformed. For the first time in 3 years, the art of invisibility was no longer Leona's armor. She stood on the deck, the cold morning air biting at her skin, watching the ripples on the lake. The clear lines between safety and danger had been replaced by a bridge she had never intended to cross. Robert found her there, his steps slow but sure. He had traded his ruined white suit for a dark, heavy coat, though he still moved with a slight stiffness from the restrained pain of his healing wound. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood beside her, his presence a calm yet authoritative force that anchored her to the present. "The traitors have been dealt with," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the quiet of the morning. "And Marcus? He won't be coming back. My mother is already planning the restructuring. She wants you to oversee the medical protocols for the entire organization." Leona turned to him, her rehearsed smile replaced by a look of profound, weary relief. I came to Chicago to be a ghost, Robert. I didn't think I'd end up as a strategist for the Sink family. You were never a ghost, Robert countered, his dark eyes softening with an unexpected electricity as he took her hands in his. You were just waiting for a reason to be seen. You saved my life. Not just with a bandage, but by reminding me that justice can exist even in our world. He pulled her closer, his touch no longer a threatening reminder of his power, but a promise of protection. Leona leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady rhythmic hammering of his heart. A heart she had kept beating with her own 2 hands. In his arms, she felt the redemption she had been searching for since that blood-slicked night in Detroit. She wasn't running anymore. Together they were writing a new chapter. One where her healing touch tempered his absolute power. The waitress who had lived in the shadows and the Mafia boss who had ruled them had found a kindred spirit in one another. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the glass walls of the retreat, Leona realized that the ghost with the scalpel had finally found a home. In the silence of the lake, they weren't just survivors. They were the architects of a new era, merging their 2 worlds into one.